Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be covering a video that is going to top off our series for Aquinas. Well not in total, but at least the 5 ways on how Aquinas proves God's existence. And this is the 5th way, or Aquinas' 5th proof for God's existence. And this way is commonly known as the argument from design. And this argument is very popular in the sense that we see a lot of design arguments today, especially if you go out and you see preachers. They would usually use the design argument, except the design argument is nowadays, at least the modern sense, is really different from Aquinas's um, 5th way or design argument, because Aquinas argues from a principle that is very, very famous and undergirds scholastic philosophy, which we will see, which is called the principle of finality. But nowadays, you might see the design argument be like, well, if, gravity, it'll usually be an inductive argument, so it'll be like, if gravity could have changed, if gravity would have changed just like maybe 0.00001, then everything would just collapse. And the most probable explanation of this is that gravity was designed and ultimately God would be the ultimate designer. Hopefully I'm not strawmanning the argument, but this is really just like a watered down brief explanation. But today we're going to be covering Aquinas' design argument for God's existence, and this one's going to operate a little bit different. Alright, let's see what Aquinas has to say regarding this proof. So he says in the Summa Theologiae, question 2, article 3, the 5th way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. Now, note that end just means purpose. And this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way as so as to obtain the best result. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly or designedly, do they achieve their end. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it is directed by some being who is actually endowed with knowledge and intelligence. And he gives the analogy, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, therefore some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being is who we call God. Okay, so Aquinas really just starts off again, remember, because Aquinas believes that we prove God a posteriori, right? We do not know God a priori because God's existence is not self-evident to us. And so he observes that things that lack intelligence, for example, a rock, wood, an arrow, these things still act for an end. That just means that they achieve their purpose, right? Fire, for instance, achieves its purpose by producing heat. And Aquinas basically just says that we observe that natural things do indeed exhibit final causality. And if you don't know what that means, final causality is part of the 4 Aristotelian causes, or the genus of causes, that is the material, the formal, and the final and the efficient cause. And the final cause is the end or the purpose for what a thing is for, right? And so when Aquinas says that natural things exhibit final causality, it means that they act towards a specific end or purpose. Thus, we see that and Aquinas even observes that these natural things act always to obtain the best result. That's not even the best grammar for me here. I don't know why I said thus we that Aquinas acts, even these natural things act always to obtain the best result. That is my bad on the grammar issue. And so they achieve their end not by luck or mere chance, but by design. This is a very key point that you have to touch up on. All right. So these things, these natural objects, they don't just achieve their purpose just by, mere luck or chance. Oh, hey, look, just by chance this fire produces heat. No. What Aquinas is saying here is that these objects, or at least these natural things, achieve their end because of design. And he says something that's really interesting. He says, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it is directed by some other being that has knowledge and is intelligent. And he gave us the example of an archer directing an arrow. So what does that mean? Right? So when we observe irrational beings like us, that is intelligent beings, we act for an end. For example, when, let's say, we want to go out and set out to build a house, we mentally conceive the image of a house, right? And building the house is the end. And the thing actually, that is the actual house, is the end, and the end or the purpose moves our actions because we conceive of it, right? But in natural objects, they're not the same as us. They do not have an intellect like us where they can conceive of an end. That is why um that is why whatever lacks the intelligence cannot move towards an end, because something that moves towards an end by itself necessarily knows that end or conceives of it. But I also need to be careful on what I mean by necessarily knows their end, because sometimes um, things don't know their end, right? But they're still directed to it. And there's a huge debate going on with, I'm pretty sure, with Scotus and Cajedon on this issue. I'm pretty sure it's the topic whether, I think it's called grace, or or the topic is grace, whether grace is supernatural to us or natural to us, or I forgot. I think it's whether God is natural to us or a supernatural end to us. Scotus, I believe, takes the position that God is natural to us because God maximizes every perfection, and we are attracted to the thing that holds the maximal degree of perfection, while the Thomist position is that no, God is a supernatural end to us. Alright, enough of that blabber because that's kind of irrelevant here. And then Aquinas thus reasons that therefore there has to be an intelligent being that exists and that guides all natural things to their end. So that would be ultimately God. And we need to note, as I said at the start, that the argument from design from Aquinas is very special because it utilizes a principle, what we call the principle of finality, and it kind of shares some similarities with the PSR, but it obviously differs. So the principle of finality states that every efficient cause acts for an end, or every action acts towards some goal or end, or every action has a purpose. Right? It goes like this. If A is by nature an efficient cause of B, then generating B must be the final cause of A. That is, if fire is by nature an efficient cause, and efficient cause just means the agent that brings in the effect, right? If fire is by nature the efficient cause of heat, then generating heat must be the final cause of fire. That is the purpose or the end of fire. So thus, if I say if a builder is by nature an efficient cause of a building, then generating that building must be the final cause of the builder. So why is this the case? This is because when the builder wants to build, right, he has to actually conceive of the actual building. And this goes back to why Aristotle said that actuality is prior to potentiality, because actuality is the thing first conceived in an action, right? And this is in a sense where Thomism says that the intellect is prior to the will in a sense, and logically prior to the will in God. Because remember, in Thomism, the will and the intellect of God are the same thing because God is absolutely simple. But the only reason why we say the intellect is prior to the will is because we logically conceive of it so in God. And that's what we call a virtual distinction. Okay, and so Aquinas expresses this principle explicitly in the Summa Theologiae as well. He says, every agent, that is, efficient cause, acts for an end. Otherwise, one thing would not follow more than another from the action of the agent unless it were by chance. And then there's also other references that I found in the Summa contra Gentiles. But you can also find this, you can find glimpses of it in Aristotle's Metaphysics. It'll come up in some pages. And you also see it in the Nicomachean Ethics that says that all things aim at some good, and it's literally just like is literally just the same as the principle of finality. Now you might ask, why can't it just be chance instead of finality? Well, Aquinas says that we observe causal regularity, meaning that we see repeatedly that A causes B, right? We repeatedly observe that fire produces heat. And this rules out chance as an explanation. Because if it was just a chance, then, if it was just by chance that fire produces heat, then it wouldn't be constantly producing it, right? That's what chance literally means. But we've seen objects without intelligence still act for an end, right? As, the arrow being directed by the archer. And secondly, the fact that there is chance, it doesn't exist. It presupposes the concept of finality, because in order for you to even make sense of chance, you must assume final causes actually exist, because chance is defined as the accidental convergence of independent causal chains that already involve finality. So what does that mean? It basically means that chance is literally two causal chains that just like get mixed up with each other, but both of those chains have finality. So I'm gonna just show you a quick example here. So just take the example from Boethius. A farmer was plowing his field when accidentally he discovered buried treasure. Wow, yay, gold, right? Whatever. And by the way, I got this from Edward Fazer's book on Introduction to Scholastic Metaphysics. It's a really great book. He represents the Thomist position really well, in my opinion. And this discovery, going back to the treasure thing, this discovery was not even intended by the farmer, right? Because the farmer, he's just trying to plow his field. Remember, the farmer here, his intention or the purpose he's plowing the field for is probably to grow crops, whatever, etc. But it's not to discover treasure, right? And so it wasn't intended by him to find that treasure. And the person who buried the treasure probably didn't intend for the farmer to actually find it. Thus, there is no causal connection between plowing a field and, let's say, finding treasure. The problem is the series that led up to that event were involved finality still. So that means the farmer still intended to plow, right? Maybe just for crops. And the person who buried it probably just intended to bury it and hide it from whatever people he hid it from. But these actions, they still involve finality. They still involve an end or a purpose, right? And thus chance is really just the convergence or the unexpected outcome of finality or end-directed actions. That is why regular causal relationships just cannot be explained by mere chance alone, because chance itself depends on finality. And if it doesn't, then you can't really make sense of the world, nor can you make sense of any action. Now, many modern philosophers argue that we really don't need chance nor final causality to even explain causal regularities. All we need to just appeal to is efficient causality, the agent, right? The agent that brings in the effect. So let's just get rid of final causality and chance. Just look at efficient causality, that is the agent. Let's look at Occam's argument or his response to Thomas Aquinas. He believes that we cannot prove that final causality or purpose exists in non-rational objects like a piece of wood or rock, an arrow, whatever, etc., etc. Although he did believe that final causality did apply to agents like us with free will, like humans, right? Because we do act for an end. Like, for example, I might go to the store and I'm acting, that is, I'm going to the store for some specific purpose or end. And so Occam thinks that non-rational objects, like natural objects, that is a rock, a wood, whatever, they don't act for a reason. In contrast to voluntary actions, like how we act voluntarily, like, we could either choose to steal or not steal. And that he says that natural events really don't need a goal or a purpose. They don't act in the same way as us, or they don't act for a purpose. And in this way, Occam is opposed to scholastic belief that final causality does exist in nature. So Thomists believe that final causality does exist in nature. And this is probably this was one of the reasons why Occam got, I'm pretty sure, excommunicated from the church, because he opposed Thomas Aquinas a lot. But he is championed as one of the greatest opponents of Thomas Aquinas. And so Occam seems convincing, because if you take his argument, right, and you look at fire, fire is the agent that produces heat necessarily from its nature, right? But it doesn't choose to do it because of some end or goal, like how we choose to act for some purpose. It does so deterministically, that is, without free will, as an efficient cause, and there is no final causality here. And that is what is meant by them trying to explain causal regularity in terms of efficient cause. The problem is that by just simply stating that this agent or this efficient cause necessitates their effect is just insufficient. Because where does this necessitation mean? Where does it even come from? And so the response is the necessity of an efficient cause must come from something. One, it could be extrinsic, that just means outside of the cause. But two, it could be intrinsic, meaning that there's something inside the cause. Now, the problem with the problem with appealing to something intrinsic is the position that leads to occasionalism. That is, if we appeal to God. And now occasionalism is simply the position that holds that God literally causes everything, every action, etc., etc. And I think, hopefully I don't want to strawman some position, but I know a lot of Muslims hold this position that that they believe in occasionalism, that God causes everything and every action. Now, It would also lead to circularity if you do appeal to natural physical laws, because these natural laws are themselves a type of regularity, right? Nature is a type of regularity as well, or the uniformity of nature is a type of regularity as well. And so really what you're doing here is, if you're trying to explain a regularity by using a regularity, it's like trying to prove the Bible using the Bible. It just doesn't make sense. It's begging the question. And that's what we call circular argumentation. But here's the reason why efficient causes cannot alone explain regularity. First of all, it's because we say that a cause is, in terms of, we're talking about the temporal sense, a cause is temporally prior to its effect, meaning that the cause exists before the effect. So effect B does not exist until cause A produces it. But then this means that the necessity of the connection comes from cause A intrinsically. That is to say, if we say that fire, that is, if A necessitates B, that is, fire necessitates heat, there's something that's inherent in fire that directs it towards B specifically. And the best explanation of this is not chance, but rather its final causality, meaning that fire is ordered or is designed towards heat as its end. Not because, it just necessarily deterministically does so, but it's ordered to do so. It's ordered by final causality or purpose. And that is why final causality is so important in explaining causation, because you need final causality to even make an action intelligible, right? Why does this certain effect follow from this cause? And thus, if one were to follow Occam's position, they would end up in a regress or a circle, because either every cause needs another cause to explain its necessity, this would lead you to an infinite regress, or one keeps redefining regularity in a way that actually never explains why it even holds. Thus, in scholasticism, the only coherent explanation, and I meant to put Thomism because scholasticism is very broad, because that can include Scotus, Occam, etc. But basically, the only coherent explanation is that natural things have an inherent directedness, or they're ordered, or they have a finality towards certain ends. And note that Aquinas does not solely believe that final causality alone can account for regularity, but rather it goes apart with all the other causes, or the genus of causes, that is, the material, the formal, the efficient, right? And so the efficient cause alone does not explain everything on its own, because the final cause, as I've said, you have to have it to even make things intelligible. That is why certain effects consistently follow from certain causes. That is why Aquinas, unlike Occam and his other opponents, Aquinas integrates all of these four genus causes into his explanation. Alright, without further ado, we need to take a look at the defense of final, since we already taken a look at the defense of final causality, let's look at another formulation of the fifth way. And here's Garrigou-Lagrange's formulation. And by the way, I'm not going to read all of it, but I will shorten it in the end, and you can read this too. But this is where I found it. So you could go here and just, look it up and read if you want. God, his existence, and his nature. Garrigou-Lagrange is a very, very, I would say, pretty good Thomist commentator. He did comment on Aquinas' Summa Theologiae and his several parts. Okay, so Garrigou-Lagrange, what you really have to bring here is his formulation, and he also brings up the principle of finality. And basically, to shorten his argument, or the fifth way, he says that irrational beings act for an end. Yes, we observe this in nature. And natural agents always or nearly always act in the same way and in a way designed to obtain that which is proper to their nature. This regularity cannot be due to chance or efficient causes alone. So potency is inherently ordered to act. Thus, every agent acts for an end. There you go. That's the principle of finality. And the order of nature shows finality, which means arranged for ends such as wings for flying, not merely as effects of efficient causes. Such direction toward ends in irrational beings require an intelligent cause, like an archer aiming an arrow. And without a supreme intelligence, the order and intelligibility of the world would come from what is blind and unintelligent, which is absurd. Therefore, there has to be a self-subsisting thought that directs all things to their proper ends. And then here's another formulation I found from a handout. This one is pretty decent. It says, A, we see that things that lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end. They achieve their end not by chance, but by design. Now, whatever lacks knowledge cannot move towards an end unless it be directed toward that end by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. And D, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end. This being is who we obviously call God. And now, thirdly, we have an objection from Peter Oriol. And this is, I got this from Kahedin's commentary on the Summa Theologiae, that is prima pars, that is the first part. And he says that the very nature or essences of natural things might be sufficient cause for the regularity which nature exhibits everywhere. So it's basically kind of the same thing as Occam, right? And so Kahedin responds, because Kahedin is the most authoritative Thomist commentator out there. Note that the Thomist position is that essences alone do not suffice to explain the unity of order among things, why certain things are connected in such a way. Because Thomists believe that nature acts for an end, which is just literally straight out of Aristotle. And Kahedin says either one, nature is pursuing an end that is conceived by itself. But this is obviously impossible for beings, because if nature is pursuing an end conceived by itself, then it presupposes intelligent beings, right? Because a rock does not conceive an end. That's literally impossible, right? Because it's a rock, it's not intelligent. Or two, nature is directed to an end intended by another. This is the correct Thomist position. And since irrational nature cannot conceive its end, there has to be some kind of external intelligence that's directing it. And this is what backs up the fifth way here, right? Alright, and thus one final formulation can be made here. 1. Irrational beings act for an end. 2. Irrational beings act for an end in such a way as to obtain the best results. 3. Irrational beings do achieve their end, but not by chance, but by design. 3a. The proof of this is that nothing can be directed to another unless there be a directing cause, which must be intelligent, since an intelligent being perceives the reasons of things. That is why we never say a rock conceives of its end, right? Because it's not intelligent. It doesn't perceive the reason of things. 4. Thus, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end or a purpose without an intelligent being actually directing it. For A, this is actually proven by the fact that irrational beings cannot move towards an end because, as I've said, they do not know the end or their formal end. 5. Thus, an intelligent designer must exist in order to direct the world. 5a. On the contrary, if there is no intelligent designer, then the world's order and intelligibility and our own intellects would come from a blind, unintelligible cause, meaning that the greater arise from the less, which is absurd. And note here, this is actually really interesting because this actually goes back to Descartes' causal principle, which says that the effect can never be greater from the cause. And I see that Garrigou-Lagrange, this is, by the way, that's where I got this from. Garrigou-Lagrange makes that interesting point, is that how can something greater come from something less? That's literally contradictory. And here it goes here with the same. It's just like, how can something come from nothing? That's impossible, right? Because if intelligibility came from something unintelligible, then that's just a literal straight contradiction. And so it would make the greater arise from the less, which is absurd and a contradiction. Therefore, we posit that there is an intelligent being who indeed directs all things to their respected ends. And now this kind of sounds like predestination, but I would just tell you quickly here that in Thomism, Thomism does believe that there is predestination. But note that in Thomism, it's very different from Calvinism's, Calvinism's, hopefully I'm pronouncing it right, Calvinism's concept of predestination. The Thomist position still holds that there is free will, and that they do believe in predestination not by the secondary causes, but by the first cause, that is God, right? And the fact that God even predestines us is actually a necessary fact for the reason why our actions are even voluntary in the first place. So that's just to let you know. And 7, the supreme intelligent being must be thought itself, self-subsisting, intellection, not an intellect directed to something higher, because nothing is above him, right? And 7a, if a being knows the ends of all things perfectly and directs them, his intellect has to be infinite. And 7b, if this intelligent being's intellect is distinct from its being, it would require something to actualize that understanding, which is contradictory. And so it really goes back to proving that God is pure act, right? There is no distinction or any composition in God. By distinction, obviously we'll have various arguments on that, because for example Thomas Aquinas does posit a distinction in God only by relation though. Like for example, the persons of the Trinity are distinguished by their relations of procession. You can read Aquinas on Reasons of the Faith, and Aquinas actually does a great job concisely proving that how the Son is generated from the Father. Not proving, but demonstrating how the Son would proceed from the Father, right? Because Thomas Aquinas' position is that there's certain articles of faith you cannot prove by natural reason, and it would be heresy if you were to actually try to. And 8, this supreme intellectual being is who we understand to be God, and that is basically the end of the argument. If you have any questions on the arguments for Occam or Thomas Aquinas' position on the principle of finality, please do ask. And that's really the thing that undergirds this whole argument. It's the principle of finality. It means that every action acts for some end, or every agent acts for some end, whether it be a natural agent, that is a rock, right? But these natural agents don't act by themselves. They are directed by something else, and ultimately everything is directed by this being, right? And that's who we call God. And that's basically the end of the argument. Thanks for watching.